I was an orphan fostered by the Liu family. The elders of the Liu family asked me to marry into the Liu family, to have Willow as my wife. And any children we have would also bear the Liu surname. I had always been deeply in love with Willow. And besides, Liu father and Liu mother had raised me. So I agreed on the spot. And married Willow. However, after marriage, Willow didn't get pregnant for a long time. My mother-in-law was furious. She not only forbade me from drinking or eating meat, but also prohibited me from staying up late or playing video games. Even so, nothing changed. And I still couldn't meet her expectations. Perplexed, my mother-in-law had me drink goji berries and take ginseng. And even asked me to kneel and pray to the Buddha every day. What she didn't know was, after all these years of marriage, Willow had never let me touch a single finger of hers. Later, when I was exhausted and lying in a hospital bed, even as my wife, Willow never came to see me for the last time. It was Makoto who kindly told me that he and Willow were preparing for their wedding and couldn't make it. That's when I found out Willow had another family outside. Only I was left alone. When I opened my eyes again, I was back at the Liu family home. Willow's mother was still joking. She asked, "George, do you like our Willow?" I replied, "No. In this life, I'm going to do what I truly like." Chapter 1. The smell of hospital disinfectant still lingered at the tip of my nose. The pain was still fresh. In front of me stood Willow's mother, my former mother-in-law, still asking, "George, do you like our Willow? After graduation, would you want Willow to be your wife?" In the living room were the Liu family and some old friends of my parents. The woman spoke so gently, with kindness and affection, completely unlike the fierce and difficult person I remembered from my past life, because I spent so little time with Willow. She had been unable to conceive for a long time, so my mother-in-law thought of all sorts of ways to make things difficult for me. She restricted my diet, forbade me from eating meat or drinking alcohol, and forced me to take traditional medicine every day, even made me pray to gods and Buddha. That wasn't the worst part. It was the constant sarcastic remarks that made me suffocate. She would question if I was a man, if I was capable at all. Once, I was pushed to the limit and nearly struck her. She cried out in desperation, claiming how hard it was to raise me, an orphan. She said that if she hadn't taken me in, I would have starved to death on the streets, that she had treated me like her own son, and entrusted her daughter to me was a great kindness, but I had repaid her kindness with ingratitude, and didn't know what was good for me. That was my Achilles heel. So in the end, I never laid a hand on her. As I regained my focus, she said, "George, stop zoning out. If you have something to say, just say it." Liu mother gave me a gentle push. I came back to my senses and looked into her eyes. Eyes that were trying to conceal her urgency. If my past self had paid more attention, I would have realized that this urgency, her rush to get me and Willow together, was about dividing up my inheritance. Even later, her push for us to have a child was for the same reason. At that time, I was just a rich second-generation heir who had grown up pampered. Having just suffered the blow of losing my parents, I thought I had found family and solace in the Liu household. How could I have suspected anything more? But now, after living through more than 30 years of a loveless marriage, and enduring the torment of Liu mother's true nature being revealed, I could see everything clearly. So, I stood up, smiled, and said, "Madam, it seems you've misunderstood. I only see Willow as a sister, and after high school, I plan to attend university." Chapter 2. Liu mother's face suddenly turned pale and green. Her question in front of everyone, asking if I liked Willow, was meant to get me to confirm the marriage with Willow. This way, she could push me to spend the wealth under my name without facing criticism. Liu mother quickly recovered. She stood up and naturally took my hand, saying to the crowd, "This child is just too shy. Willow, why don't you take George for a walk in the garden?" Willow was sitting across from me on the sofa. The youthful Willow, young, beautiful, and a bit aloof. She was wearing a light beige polka dot dress, the hem falling just below her calves, light and natural. A matching ribbon at her waist accentuated her slim figure. Since Liu father was a close friend of my parents, Willow and I could barely be called childhood sweethearts. Since I was little, I always liked to revolve around her. When we were kids, we got along well, but as we grew older, Willow became distant. In my past life, I didn't understand and just assumed it was a matter of growing up and needing to be more mindful of the opposite sex. I never thought that, in reality, Willow was simply tired of me. I was a somewhat overbearing young master with a bad temper. Yet, she had to follow her parents' orders and listen to me. Even though she didn't like me, she couldn't shake me off. Naturally, Willow grew frustrated. If she had ignored me, that would have been fine. But instead, she married me, but never allowed me to touch her. Married me, but had an affair outside. I hated her. I hated myself even more. blinded by emotion. I ended up living such a miserable life. I clenched my fists and slowly loosened them. I gently pulled my hand away from Lou Mother's grip. Still smiling, I said, "You don't need to accompany me, Willow. You should be seeing Makoto soon, right? If you like him, you should bring him home sooner." One of the guests spoke up. "Willow has someone she likes. Then why is your mom matchmaking you?" It was only then that I looked at Willow. Her face was even worse than Lou Mother's. The corners of her eyes were slightly red. I couldn't be bothered to look any longer. I greeted the people in the room and left on my own. Chapter 3. Leaving the living room. I went straight to the front yard mailbox and started rummaging through it. Among the letters, I finally found one addressed to me. "George." Willow's voice came from behind. I turned around, silently hiding the letter behind my back. She asked, "Why did you say that today?" I frowned and asked, "What do you mean?" She responded, "You confessed to me yesterday, and today you say you treat me like a sister. Are you playing with me? My mom treats you like her own son, and you publicly made her lose face." I quietly looked at her. I thought of my past life. After marriage, Lou Mother didn't once fail to make me lose face in front of others. If I showed the slightest displeasure, it would invite Willow's resentment. She angrily said, "Hasn't my mom been good to you? She's an elder, so why should it matter if she says a few words?" So now, I returned the same words to her. I smiled and said, "Your mom treats me like her own son, but even her own son can be rebellious. What's wrong with saying a few things to her?" She bit her lip and remained silent for a while, then said, "You're acting strange." To her, I was indeed acting strange. After all, in my past life, when my parents passed away, I truly considered the Lou family my own. I had changed from my previously arrogant self. I wouldn't dare speak harshly to Lou Mother, and I was always careful to please Willow. I sneered. "So, what are you upset about now? Aren't you the one who hated me chasing after you? Now that I say I don't like you, just like you wanted, why are you upset?" After saying that, I tried to walk away, but I still wanted to open the letter in my hand. Willow spoke up again. I didn't. Chapter 4. I replied, "It doesn't matter." I thought to myself, "None of it matters, Willow. Whether you love me or not, it's meaningless." Willow frowned and said, "Trying to say nice things doesn't work, George. You're still so hard to deal with. With my parents gone, I had no one to rely on." So Willow's attitude toward me had also changed significantly. In the past, she wouldn't dare to raise her voice, but now, she openly called me difficult. Am I hard to deal with? I simply didn't follow her expectations. Her so-called nice words were just attempts to keep me under control, to lure me into proposing to her. In my past life, after we got engaged, the Lou family immediately used the excuse of needing funds for their business expansion. They made me put up most of my assets to pave the way for the Lou family. This was when private businesses were opening up. Everywhere was a chance to make money. With my help, the Lou family took control of the real estate and food industries in City A, becoming the richest family in the area. In over 30 years of a false marriage, everyone envied me for marrying into a wealthy family, but they didn't know that without me, George, the Lou family would never have reached such heights. In this life, let me stand at the top, looking down on the clowns of the Lou family. Let them dance their foolish dance and destroy themselves. I couldn't be bothered to say more, so I smiled and said, "I'm difficult to deal with. So what? If you don't like it, deal with it." Chapter 5. Back in the room, I hurriedly tore open the letter. I actually have an uncle. He shares the same father with my mother, but they have different mothers. He currently resides in F country. I met this uncle once. At the time, he came to our house seeking help to treat his elderly mother. My parents provided financial assistance and introduced him to a good hospital. Afterward, our two families kept in touch from time to time, but in recent years, we lost contact. In my past life, I didn't know that my uncle had gone abroad to seek his fortune and had struck it rich by chance. He didn't learn about my parents' car accident and death until a year later, when he found out I had been adopted by the Lou family. He wrote to me. The letter was sent to my old home and then passed on to the Lou family's mailbox. Lou mother had always known about my letter, but she chose to keep it hidden and say nothing. It was only many years later that I found out my uncle had been sending me money and letters all along, but by that time, it was too late. After reading the letter, I learned that my uncle couldn't return to the country for some reason. So he chose to contact me through letters. This was his 10th letter, and the content was the same as the previous ones. He introduced his situation abroad and offered me words of comfort, asking if I would be willing to come to F country. F country is advanced, with top-tier education and specialized programs. The letter contained 10 large foreign currency bills and a flight ticket to F country. My nose tingled with emotion. How wonderful. I'm not an orphan. I have family. The flight was departing in 4 days from the neighboring South City. I steeled myself. Next, I needed to handle my parents' inheritance. The property would stay as is. Since the location was good and had potential for appreciation, I would split the money into 2 accounts. One half would be kept abroad, and the other half would remain in the bank. Also, I didn't really know my uncle, so I would ensure my safety before contacting him or his family. Chapter 6. Fortunately, the college entrance exams had already finished. I used the excuse of going out to hang out with classmates. It was convenient for dealing with things. At the bank, I ran into some classmates, and they happily said, "We were just looking for you. Let's go." Class reunion. The gathering was at the biggest KTV in the city. At the time, singing karaoke was still a trendy activity. When I arrived, Willow was already there. A friend joked, "Why isn't George here today?" "Yeah. Where's your husband?" Willow frowned and complained, "I'm so sick of seeing him, and I don't like George. I wouldn't marry him." Laughter filled the room. Another friend asked, "Then who do you like?" "Our class president." The group joked around, pushing Willow toward Makoto. The guys around me awkwardly coughed. The colorful lights blinked, and only then did everyone notice me. I confidently walked over and said, "What a lively atmosphere. Please, continue." Willow instinctively leaned closer to Makoto and frowned. "George, what are you trying to pull now?" "Trying to pull something." I wanted nothing more than to expose these two, but nothing had happened yet. If I were to say that these two had ruined my life in my past life, who would believe me? I smiled and said, "Willow, if I'm so annoying, why did you always take my gifts?" "What? Taking gifts doesn't mean you agree. You're really shameless." Before she could respond, I clapped my hands and said, "Fine, if I'm not welcome, I'll leave." No one had reacted in time. I had already pushed open the door and left. Willow followed quickly and said, "George, listen to me." Behind me, I heard a classmate shout. Makoto fainted. Willow quickly abandoned me and said, "George, that was just a slip of the tongue. Let me explain later." "Okay." Before she finished speaking, she was already rushing to Makoto's side. I looked coldly at her, then turned and walked away decisively. There would be no chance for an explanation. In 3 days, I would be heading to F country. From now on, I would never think of you again, and you shouldn't think of me either. Chapter 7. The next day, I packed up my room, throwing away what needed to be thrown away. Lou's mother came over and subtly asked which university I planned to apply to. Of course, I wouldn't tell her I was going abroad to study. I casually mentioned South City University, just to brush it off. Lou's mother praised the university, then, with a quick shift of tone, brought up Willow's marriage again. She said, "You can get engaged first. It won't affect you and Willow going to university." Before I could even refuse, she quickly comforted me, saying, "I've already asked Willow. She and that Makoto are just ordinary classmates. You're overthinking things." I was speechless. She still wouldn't let it go. I distanced myself from Lou's mother and said, "Madam, I truly have no interest in Willow." Lou's mother didn't believe me. She quickly reassured me. "Good boy. I'll make sure Willow breaks it off completely with that classmate." Those words, unfortunately, were overheard by Willow. She didn't understand the situation, but quickly walked over to me. Her gaze was filled with disappointment and disgust. She angrily said, "Young master, do you need everyone to revolve around you? Makoto is weak, and his family isn't well off. I've just been looking out for him a little. Why do you have to make it public and even report to my mother?" As if venting her frustration, she tugged at the bracelet on her wrist. The beads fell off, clattering to the ground. They scattered everywhere, disappearing from sight. She said bitterly, "I was going to apologize to you, but now it seems unnecessary. I'm telling you clearly, there's nothing between me and Makoto. I won't distance myself from him because of you." After venting her anger, Willow kicked over the trash bin by the door. The bin fell to the ground, spilling out miscellaneous items, figurines, scarves she knitted herself, origami cranes, and little stars, all rolled out. Willow's eyes reddened in an instant. She bit her lip and said, "These were all gifts I gave you." I frowned and said, "Well, if you don't like them, then throw them away." I kicked the beads that had rolled at my feet. They were just nuisances. Chapter 8. In 2 days, I would board a flight to F country. The distance from a city to South City wasn't short. I had to head to South City in advance. I had already prepared my passport for a previous overseas trip. I didn't have many belongings. The valuables and property certificates were stored in a bank safe deposit box. Lou's father and Lou's mother were away on business in another city, so I didn't need to say goodbye to them in person. They had indeed taken care of me for many years, but it was all for the inheritance. The money my uncle sent was withheld by Lou's mother. It had been enough for my expenses all these years. As I was dragging my suitcase out, I ran into Willow and Makoto in the lobby. It seemed like they had just come back from somewhere. Willow noticed the luggage in my hand. She asked, "Where are you going? Are you going to report to my mom about me and Makoto again?" I motioned for them to step aside and said, "Not interested. I'm just going to a classmate's house." Madam already knows. That wasn't a lie. I did tell Lou mother I would be staying at a classmate's house for a couple of days. Willow, still in a bad mood, coldly said, "Go by yourself. Don't let the driver pick you up. That's my family's driver, not yours." I didn't care. Makoto, who had been silent, suddenly spoke up in a humble tone. "George, I was just kicked out by my family and have nowhere to go. Willow kindly offered to let me stay. I heard from Madam that you and Willow had some unpleasantness because of me, and I'm really sorry." Willow snorted and said, "You don't need to apologize to him." Willow wrapped her arm around Makoto's and said, "If it weren't for his big mouth, my mom wouldn't have bothered you." It was clear they were both in cahoots. I found it meaningless and just walked ahead. Behind me, Makoto continued in a weak tone, "Willow, don't you want to go talk to George?" She replied, "I don't need to bother with him. He's an orphan with no home to return to. He'll come back sooner or later." Willow's tone was firm, cold and disdainful. I paused for a moment, then continued walking. So they really thought I had nowhere else to go and treated me this way. It didn't matter. When we meet again, I'll make sure they taste the feeling of having no place to go. Chapter 9. The first day George left. Willow didn't feel much. On the second day, she grew restless and asked the housekeeper, "Has George not come back yet?" The housekeeper shook his head. The young woman's beautiful brows furrowed slightly as she complained, "I can't stand him. Who does he think he is? What's so special about him? He acts like he's some rich young master." After venting, she asked the housekeeper again, "Did George say he went to a classmate's house?" The housekeeper shook his head again. Willow felt even more irritated. It was as if there was a heavy stone pressing on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Passing by George's room, she noticed something shiny by the large-leaved plant near the door. She realized something and bent down to pick it up. It was a lone bead from the bracelet. Willow was momentarily stunned. Then, as if compelled, she squatted down and searched for other beads. A feeling of regret rose in her heart. Why did she pull apart the bracelet? This was clearly the graduation gift she had planned for George. She had prepared it with great care. George was arrogant and overbearing, but after his parents passed away, he had mellowed out. She knew this too, but why had she acted so willfully toward him? She thought, when George returns, she would sincerely apologize to him, but she waited 1 day, then 2, then 3, and still, George didn't come home. Her anxiety reached its peak. She began calling George's friends. The answer from each of them was that they hadn't seen George. She didn't believe it. She went from house to search, but still couldn't find him. Finally, she opened the door to George's room. The once cozy room was now missing all the stuffed animals she had given him, the ones she had loved since childhood. George's clothes and shoes were gone as well. The room suddenly felt so much emptier. Willow hurriedly searched the room, trying to find any traces that George had ever lived there, but the only thing she found was a letter pressed under a book on the desk. It read, "I'm gone, Mr. and Mrs. Please don't worry." Just a few words. But none of it was meant for Willow. Chapter 10. After the plane landed, I didn't immediately call my uncle using the contact details he gave me. Instead, I hired a detective to check on my uncle's family situation. Nothing too detailed, just a simple inquiry to see if the family was harmonious, etc. I thought to myself, no family that's already in chaos would willingly accept a stranger relative. Thankfully, the news I received was good. My uncle owned a large farm in a certain state. He had a decent reputation locally, and his family members were few and got along well. I also prepared for the worst. If my uncle wasn't reliable, I could still study in F country by myself. It wasn't a big deal. After completing the investigation and buying gifts for everyone, I finally contacted my uncle. When he found out I had arrived, he immediately came to pick me up. 3 days later, I finally arrived at my uncle's farm. My uncle was more than 10 years older than my mother. Due to his early years of gold mining, combined with the harsh sun and wind, he looked much older. He wasn't very talkative, especially with me. He just sighed and said, "When I see you, I think of your mother." Then he handed me a card and told me to spend it as I wished. He took me to ride horses around the farm and let me mess around with the big dog he kept. The dog didn't look pleased. My aunt was a slightly plump white woman. She was great at making desserts, but I have to say, the desserts were really sweet. Eating too many made me feel sick. But she was incredibly enthusiastic, always trying new ways to make me treats. My uncle's daughter was already married to a Chinese-American man. Thanks to my sister and brother-in-law, I could still enjoy some Chinese food. My uncle's son was only a year older than me. When he saw that I was a little introverted and didn't talk much, he patted me on the shoulder and said, "Bro, with your height and build, just get a car, tidy up a little, and the girls will be all over you." Then he took me to all kinds of young people's parties and gatherings. With him around, I quickly blended in with the local youth. After the summer break, it was time to start university. Thanks to my uncle's connections, I went straight to my cousin's university. I chose a major in finance. Nothing special, my past experiences and my current assets were enough for me to make a career. Chapter 11. Life in F country was much warmer than I expected. During the holidays, I played around the farm and helped out with chores. At school, I attended classes with classmates from all over the world and worked on assignments. In my second year, after doing sufficient research, I decided to try my hand at international trade to gain some experience. I discussed it with my uncle. He didn't reject my decision. Instead, he asked if I had enough money and whether I wanted him to introduce me to some business owners. Having a mentor would certainly help, as it would save me some time, but for a beginner like me, making mistakes wasn't a big deal. I was young, with time, money, and room for trial and error. So, I teamed up with 3 other classmates to invest in a small company. We started exporting F countries' clothing and food to neighboring countries. A year later, in my third year, the company made a small profit, but each classmate had their own ambitions. Some wanted to make more money and start their own business, while others felt the profits were unstable and decided to bail out. So, we announced the dissolution of the company. Starting the company gave me a lot of experience. If I owned a factory and handled the products directly, I would make even more money. I made another plan, did more research, and prepared to start another business before graduation. During my free time, I used the money I earned to buy a car for my uncle. I also bought an apartment near the school for myself and lived with my cousin. In the apartment, we adopted many stray cats. Some were disabled, some were healthy. I took them all in. When the sunlight poured onto the balcony, the furry creatures would curl up into a ball and sleep at my feet. I would pet one and tease another, and it would make me think of my past life. On our first wedding anniversary, I remembered that both Willow and I liked cats. Willow had said on our wedding day that we should get a cat together, so I bought a little Siamese kitten as a surprise for her. But when I brought it back, Lou father and Lou mother immediately complained. They said that our priority now should be preparing Willow for pregnancy, and the cat would affect a pregnant woman. The poor Siamese kitten didn't know what it did wrong. Curling up in my arms, looking pitiful, I had no choice but to give it to a classmate who also loved cats. I gave them money and supplies and visited the kitten regularly. Now, I held a large long-haired ginger cat, and it felt like I hadn't thought about Willow or her family for a long time. After all, I was happy now. No need to remember those bad memories. Chapter 12. In the second semester of my third year, I started a new company. This time, I got into the dairy industry, from raising cows to processing dairy products. I was gradually improving the entire industry chain. By the time I graduated, the production chain was fully established. This allowed me to drastically reduce costs, whether it was the business in F country or the export business. I now had the confidence to negotiate prices with partners. Once everything was stable, I proposed to go back to my home country to visit. My uncle didn't stop me. My cousin accompanied me back. As soon as we landed, someone covered my eyes. She asked, "George, guess who I am?" I was speechless. It was none other than my business partner, the Spanish beauty Monica. She was the only one who had been with me since college. She asked, "George, aren't you surprised?" I replied, "Wasn't the plan to negotiate for land? If you came along, who's handling it?" Her bright eyes flashed as she said, "In your heart, the company isn't as important as me, right?" I replied, "Of course, don't try to play the pity card." My cousin, laughing from the side, said, "She's as pretty as your secretary." Then he secretly gave Monica a thumbs up, saying, "Go for it." Encouraged, Monica happily handed me the breakfast she had prepared, but just as she was about to give it to me, another tall figure appeared next to me. The person stood in between us and casually handed me a lunch box. Her hand was as soft as a young shoot, her skin as smooth as porcelain. She thoughtfully took out a wet wipe from her bag and offered to clean my hands. In a sweet voice, she said, "The car is ready, boss." Anna had a sweet voice but an icy appearance. I turned to look, and her delicate features caught my eye. She stared at me, standing in front of Monica as though she didn't even notice her. My secretary was getting more and more possessive. I sighed and got into the car. Chapter 13. There had been many changes at home. First, I went to my parents' graves to pay my respects. When I arrived, there was a dried bouquet of white chrysanthemums by the tombstone, swaying in the wind. It was probably left by some old friends of my parents. I moved the flowers aside and placed my own bouquet. I spoke to my parents about my life abroad. I told them how my uncle had taken good care of me, how my aunt was a great cook, except for the desserts, and how my sister and brother-in-law were struggling with taking care of their newborn. When it came to me, I said everything was going well. I had family to rely on, graduated as an excellent student, and met many like-minded people in business. I said, "Don't worry, I'm taking good care of myself. It started to rain. The rain was salty as it slid into my mouth. After the ceremony, we walked out of the cemetery. My cousin held an umbrella for Monica. Anna walked beside me. Just as we passed a man and a woman. The woman was holding a bouquet of white chrysanthemums. The man, holding an umbrella behind her, spoke in a sharp tone. He said, "You could come every day and still not see George. You're carrying our child. Why can't you consider my feelings?" The voice sounded familiar yet strange. I instinctively turned to look. It was none other than Makoto and Willow. When my cousin and Monica heard my name, they looked at me. I shook my head, signaling them to ignore it. Makoto kept talking. Suddenly, Willow stopped, turned around, grabbed his umbrella, and threw it aside. She said, "Can you give me a break? You're really annoying." Makoto, enraged, stomped on the umbrella he had thrown to the ground. Seeing the two of them about to cause a scene in front of my parents' tomb, I hurriedly asked the cemetery staff to handle it. As for why I didn't reveal myself to Willow right away, I came back to the country not for her. I was interested in the current real estate market. If I came back to discuss business, I didn't want to get involved in any drama. Chapter 14. It was rather unfortunate. When I went to visit the old house, I ran into an elder. He was an old friend of my parents and the Liu family. He quickly called Liu mother to inform her that I had returned. Liu mother was very excited and asked me to wait for her. She said, "You kid, why didn't you tell me you were back? I was so worried about you. Wait for me to come pick you up." I replied, "No need, madam. I have other matters to attend to." The next second, I hung up the phone myself. I returned the phone to the elder. By the time Liu mother and her daughter arrived, we had already left for a hotel in the city. We were going to attend a banquet that evening. It was a chance to meet with several developers from City A and discuss potential cooperation. The banquet was quite grand. We were used to toasting and socializing in F country, so we were right at home here as well. At the banquet, I had pleasant conversations with a few of the business owners. Part of this was due to my own perspective on business, and part of it was because these people had a shallow connection with my parents. I had the network, and the business talks went smoothly. Halfway through the event, there was some noise at the entrance of the hall. The host, Martin, looked displeased and asked what was happening. The staff replied, "Mr. Liu has no invitation but insists on entering." Martin looked at me. He knew I had been adopted by the Liu family. He smiled and said, "It's just a mistake. They forgot to send an invitation to Mr. Liu. Please, let him in." On the surface, I remained indifferent, but inside, I couldn't help but find it amusing. Forgot to send an invitation. It was simply that they looked down on the Liu family's wealth. Without my financial support, the Liu family's small company would struggle to survive. In fact, due to various policy changes, their company was almost on the brink of bankruptcy. In such a situation, who would still want to deal with the Liu family? I didn't stop Martin from letting them in. After all, outsiders didn't know the history between me and the Liu family. If word got out that I was being ungrateful, it wouldn't look good for me. So, outwardly, I maintained appearances. Chapter 15. Willow's gaze immediately locked on me. She was wearing a slightly worn high-end dress. Due to the recent scuffle, it was a little wrinkled, but she didn't bother to fix it and quickly walked toward me. She said, "George, you're finally back." Her eyes were filled with an eager spark, making her dull, lifeless eyes shine brightly. I didn't move. Just as Willow was about to reach me, 3 people stood in front of me. My cousin frowned and asked, "Who are you?" Monica put her hands on her hips and said, "Why is there another one?" Anna, having just taken a sip of water, pursed her lips and cleared her throat, ready to start scolding. I sighed. We were serious business people after all. Willow's eyes suddenly turned red. She asked, "George, why?" I had no intention of reminiscing with her, so I said, "It's been a long time. I still have things to do. You're free to do as you wish." Behind Willow, Liu mother followed closely. She, relying on her age, shamelessly squeezed through and said, "George, you kid, why did you just run off without a word? Where have you been all these years?" She grabbed my hand and began wiping her tears. I expressionlessly pulled my hand away from hers and said, "Madam, the letter my uncle sent you, you received it. Why didn't you tell me? Besides, I left a note when I left." Everyone in the room was sharp-witted. After I said these 2 sentences, everyone could roughly guess what had happened. It wasn't because Liu mother cared about me. It was because she cared too much about the wealth I owned. It was clear without saying much. Liu mother immediately stopped crying. She forced a smile and said, "George, don't be angry. How was I supposed to know if it was a scam? By the way, after you left, Willow looked for you for a long time. You two should catch up." She said this and forcibly pulled Willow to my side. Willow didn't say anything, just stared at me with red eyes. Her gaze made me uncomfortable. I furrowed my brow, and Anna walked over, telling Willow to keep her distance from me. She said, "Please keep your distance from my husband." I was speechless. Monica snorted and said, "A guy who couldn't even win me over. You should give up already." Willow didn't look at them, just kept staring at me and asked, "Why did you leave? Don't you know how long I searched for you?" I shook my head and said, "I don't know. Don't care to know. Not interested in knowing, and don't want to know." Chapter 16. Willow choked up. She took a bracelet out of her pocket and said, "I fixed this for you. I came to find you the day because I wanted to make up with you. George, I promise I won't be foolish again." She spoke with such sincerity, her eyes gleaming with tears. Monica glanced at the bracelet and then covered her mouth, giving a shallow smile. "Are you still in high school? What's this? So cheap and childish." Willow looked at me deeply, her voice filled with a pitiful tone. She said, "I'll do anything you want, just please don't ignore me. As for gifts, I never cared about their value, nor did I care whether I liked them or not. In the past, when Willow gave me her beloved doll, I was happy for a long time. The happiness came from the fact that someone I liked had given it to me. Now, not only did I no longer like Willow, but I couldn't even bring myself to waste any feelings of dislike on her. She was too weak, putting aside the emotions that had clouded my judgment in my past life. She wasn't even worthy of being my opponent. I said, "I still appreciate your rebellious nature. Your attempts to control me, they're quite amusing." She choked up and said, "George, those were just words out of anger." She hurriedly explained. I thought. I waved my hand and said, "It doesn't matter." I took a glass of champagne from a waiter, saying indifferently, "Does your husband know you're here to see me? Please don't waste my time with business." "Okay." Willow's lips trembled, clearly shaken by the blow. In my past life, if I had wanted to say even one more word to her, she would have said, "Don't disturb her. She had a lot to do. She was doing her hair, shopping, baking." But in truth, all she was doing was spending every night with Makoto, having children, and living a carefree life. As I was about to leave, Willow panicked. She said, "Please don't go. Let's start over." "Okay." Before I could respond, my cousin spoke up first. "Is your husband running over here to seduce my cousin? Who is this woman?" Willow's face turned pale. She trembled and said, "I didn't mean to hide my marriage, George. I just wanted to win you back. Please don't be angry. I was tricked by Makoto. He drugged me, and that's how I made a mistake. All these years, I've kept myself for you." Wait, can we please not insult the phrase, "kept myself"? What's there for me to be angry about? In the end, Lou mother and daughter were still escorted out by Martin. The banquet ended, but Willow was still waiting to see me. Unexpectedly, Makoto arrived, and started punching and kicking her. He yelled at her, "You're carrying my child, and you're still going to meet with another man. How cheap can you be?" Pregnant women tend to be more irritable. And Willow lost her temper, yelling at him to get away. The two of them ended up fighting. In the end, Makoto, furious, landed a punch and knocked Willow down. The crimson liquid began to trail down her leg. I turned my gaze away and got into the car. Even as the blood kept flowing, Willow still screamed towards my car from a distance, continuously shouting my name. My cousin, in disbelief, said, "She really is obsessed." "What a trashy woman." I corrected him. "It's not obsession. She's trying to use our past to move me, to get me to help the Liu family. This kind of woman only loves herself." Chapter 17. The business negotiations went quite well. I will be co-investing with Martin and others to develop the largest new shopping mall in a city. Due to the preliminary preparations, I need to stay in the country for a while. Monica headed back first. Before she left, she couldn't stop nagging me. "There's an old saying in your country, a good horse doesn't eat the grass it passed by. Don't make up with that guy. Also, that female secretary of yours is no good. Her voice is so soft, you can tell she's a pretentious coquette." Anna quietly walked over and said, "Boss, actually I can do a dominatrix voice too." I rolled my eyes at both of them and said, "Right now, I only want to make money. If you waste my time, I'll fire you both." Monica shot Anna a glare, huffed angrily, and got on the plane. Anna, however, silently adjusted her collar, seemingly trying to make her cleavage more obvious. I was speechless. After Willow's miscarriage, she came to find me a few times. Later, she became too preoccupied with her own issues and gave up. The Ito family felt utterly humiliated when they discovered Willow had cheated while pregnant, and they gathered together. They came to a city demanding an explanation from the Liu family. The Liu family's company was already struggling. After being stirred up by Makoto's relatives, they immediately declared bankruptcy. They even hired a good lawyer to help Makoto and Willow fight their divorce case. Makoto ended up with most of Liu family's remaining assets. Liu father, in despair over the bankruptcy, hanged himself at the company's old site. Liu mother, devastated by the shock, became mentally unstable and wandered around, talking to the air. muttering to an imaginary son-in-law. She's your wife. Isn't it natural to spend money on your wife? Marrying an orphan like you was a downgrade. You should at least put some effort into it. Later, she ran onto the street, throwing a tantrum, and was hit by passing vehicles. She ended up paralyzed in bed. Willow begged Makoto for money to pay for her mother's treatment. Most of Makoto's money had already gone to his relatives, and he had nothing left. What's more, Makoto had a grudge against the Liu family and refused to help. The two of them began arguing again. This time, Willow blamed all her misfortunes on Makoto, but Makoto, not tolerating her, beat her senseless. However, no one knew that Willow had brought a knife with her. In the next moment, she attacked, leading to Makoto's death. Willow was quickly arrested. Meanwhile, I kindly visited Liu's mother in the hospital and paid for her medical fees. Everyone praised me for my loyalty, but they didn't know I had hired the worst nurse for her. Soon, she was covered in bed sores, her entire body emitting a terrible stench. I stood beside her, smiling, and said, "Madam, you have memories from your past life, don't you? When you tormented me, did you ever think that one day, you'd end up in my hands? You knew Willow was seeing someone else, but you still accused me of being incapable. When I was starving, taking medicine and bowing my head, your family was enjoying the good life. You got to enjoy your happiness while I suffered. Now it's your turn to feel what I went through." Liu's mother opened her eyes wide in anger, swinging her arms. But she couldn't even touch my sleeves. She could only open her mouth, drooling. Her eyes were filled with resentment. I wasn't going to let her die. I would keep her alive, barely hanging on. Before Willow was executed, she requested to see me. I agreed. When she saw me, she cried and confessed. She said her mind was filled with memories that didn't belong to her. She saw how her indifference towards me in the past had caused me to live a lonely life. She asked, "Can you forgive me? I love you." I never faced my true feelings, because I wanted to escape my parents' control. I always listened to them, but when they told me to love you, I became angry and rebelled. How childish of me. Now I've lost everything. She sobbed. I shook my head. She actually laughed at herself and said, "It's okay. Hate me if you want. This life is so miserable for me. Maybe it's my punishment." This time, I couldn't help but laugh. I said, "Punishment? How could it be so coincidental?" The reflection in the glass showed my slightly excited expression as I said, "You think your company's downfall was just a result of the environment? You think Makoto found the banquet location by coincidence? You think it was so easy for you to miscarry? You think those poor relatives of his could easily find a top-notch legal team for him?" Willow's face slowly drained of color, until it was completely pale, but her eyes were bloodshot. She asked, "Do you hate me this much?" Why wouldn't I hate her? In my past life, I didn't do anything that would harm anyone. Yet, I lived a life worse than death. It was because the Liu family coveted my wealth, ruining my entire life. In this life, I've only made a few small adjustments, and I'm already being merciful. Those choices were all made by the Liu family themselves. I stood up, leaving Willow with my last words. "I'll let your mother know about your execution." I left the prison and got into a car. The black sedan sped through the rain. The newly divided commercial district had already started to take shape. With tall buildings rising up, the future that belonged to me was on its way.